Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to another Sunday morning talk series. Today's guest is Jim Scott, who will give a talk on the Canadian perspective of diversity, ethics, and morals. Jim Scott was the chief audit for Whale Inco Limited. His previous roles in the finance group included heading the international tax planning, financial planning, and analysis team, and acting as chief negotiator for aspects of the Goro and Voices Bay project. Jim holds a BA of Commerce degree from the University of Toronto and is chartered accountant in Ontario, certified public accountant in Illinois, and certified internal auditor, and holds a certification in risk management assurance. Meanwhile, he teaches courses at the University of Toronto, York University, and Ryerson University sessionally. Jim is a good friend of us, and we had opportunity to have conversations with him on the concept of diversity, ethics, especially in Canadian concepts. And we thought it would be beneficial for our people, especially people from Iran, to hear from a good citizen about his perspective of diversity and why and how diversity is important and how a society can deal with it and benefit from diversity and ethnic diversity and linguistic diversity especially. So without any further delay, I will pass the mic to Jim, and welcome again, Jim. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Good, good. Before I start, a couple of quick caveats. First, thank you, Lale, for the introduction. I'm a businessman, an entrepreneur, and a part-time teacher. And caveat number one, I am not a professional ethicist, nor am I a PhD in social science. So the opinions that I'm offering you here are the opinions of a regular citizen rather than an international expert in the field. And as such, I see our talk this morning as being more of a discussion, more of a dialogue than a lecture. Second caveat, I'm going to be talking about the Canadian approach to some of these issues, and I'm going to be using stories from the Canadian history and from my own personal history. In doing so, I'm not suggesting that the Canadian way is the only way, or even suggesting that the Canadian way is the best way. But sometimes when you're dealing with an issue that affects all of us, hearing how one group of people have chosen to deal with it, the approaches that they've taken, their successes and their failures, helps to understand it. It gives you sort of the material to use to discuss it further. And I'm hoping that we can discuss it further after my talk this morning. Now, my talk is going to be in two parts. I'm going to talk first of all about diversity, ethnic, cultural, linguistic, and about the Canadian model and the Canadian experience. I'm going to talk a little bit about history, but don't worry, not too much. You're not going to fall asleep. I hope not, anyway. And also, I'm going to give you some specific examples from my experience and from Canada's experience. The second half, I'm going to talk about ethics and morality. I'm going to talk about what the difference is between those, about the way that the two interact, because right now in the world, that interaction is especially important.
No, you don't talk. Nobody.
We good? I heard somebody.
Yeah, you have the host status. Could you remote everyone? Thank you. Yeah.
We good?
I mean.
And again, I'm going to give you some specific stories and some examples. So that said, let me start in on the subject of diversity. And I'm going to start with a little bit of Canadian history, because one of the reasons why Canada is what it is today is because of their history. Canada was founded 300 years ago by basically two countries, France and what was then England. And at that point, pretty much everybody in Canada who was not an Aboriginal was either French or British. Well, of course, as you can expect, the French and the British started fighting. You may have heard of the 7 Years' War back in the mid-1700s. There was a big battle in Canada in 1759 at the Plains of Abraham, and the British beat the French. And then they signed a treaty in 1763 where the French had to give Canada to the British. Now, back then, remember, we're talking 18th century here. Back then, it was unusual for a conqueror to say to the people that he just conquered, I'm going to allow you to keep your religion. The French were Catholic, the British weren't. I allow you to keep your language. I'm going to allow you to keep your culture. I'm going to allow you to keep your law. But that's exactly what the British did. So from before Canada was even Canada, it was a bicultural and bilinguistic nation. Canada has two, even today, Canada has two legal, formal, official languages, French and English. Now, what happened next is the English and the French lived together and worked together for many years. Canada is also one of the largest countries in the world. We're the second largest country after Russia, and we have one of the lowest population densities. For every square kilometer of Canada, there are 4 people. Just to give you an example, for Turkey, there are 100 people. For Britain, there are 300. We have 4. So we started taking in immigrants like you wouldn't believe in the 1800s, the 19th century. The Irish potato famine, come to Canada. The Chinese who helped to build the Canadian Railroad, come to Canada and we'll give you land if you survive. All these different people coming in. Fast forward, 1963, Canada said, you know, this French-English issue, we need to talk about this. Like, we need to decide what we're going to do. And they created what's called a Royal Commission, which is, you know, a formal body to study. And what happened was, as they started studying the question of biculturalism, they realized, you know something, Canada is not bicultural anymore. Canada is multicultural. And we're asking the wrong question. By asking how do the French and English respect each other and work together, that's only one piece of a much larger puzzle. So in 1971, Canada was the first country in the world to have an official policy on multiculturalism, where they said officially, we are a multicultural country. And then in 1982, when we established the Canadian Bill of Rights, they said flat out, let me just show you this. They said flat out, we are the Charter of Rights shall be interpreted consistent with a multicultural heritage of Canadians. Can everybody see that slide? Good. So we are a little bit ahead of the curve. Because we're so big, because we've taken in refugees, we've taken in immigrants from everywhere, multiculturalism has been a part of the Canadian experience forever. Speaking for myself, my 4 grandparents, not one of them was born in Canada. I'm second generation Canadian, but my family has been in Canada for only about 60, 70 years. And I'm normal. In fact, they say Toronto, the city I live in, the largest city in Canada, is, first of all, the BBC says we are the single most multicultural city in the world. BBC study a few years ago, and 51% of the people who live in Toronto were not born in Canada. I'm not saying they weren't born in Toronto. I'm saying they were not born in Canada. So anyway, this is where we sit. Now, there's an expression that you use in Canada about the Canadian mosaic versus the American melting pot. It's possible to have many immigrants come into the country, but the way that you approach immigration, the expectations you place on an immigrant are different. Now, in America, what they say, and I'm simplifying, is they say, when you come to America, we want you to come to America because you want to be an American. We want you to think of yourself as an American. We don't want you to say you are a Scottish American or an Irish American or a Persian American or an Italian American. We want you to say, I'm an American. And they want American culture to some extent to subsume your existing culture. And as a result, if somebody comes in to America and they are, enjoying Persian holidays, if they are dancing Azerbaijani dance, if they are speaking a different language, there's an element of discomfort there. Because they're saying, don't you really want to be American? Like, why are you doing this? If you want to speak Italian and to eat Italian food and to only do Italian things, why don't you go back to Italy? But that's the American. Well, Canada believes that the country, in Canada, instead of a melting pot where you throw everybody into this pot, you mix them all together, and what comes out is a heterogeneous American. What we believe in is a mosaic where you've got little stones with people who are bringing different experiences, different backgrounds, different cultures, different languages, different foods, different everything. And that mosaic as a whole is what makes the true Canadian experience. Let me just see if I can show you something here. Oops, don't do that. Yeah, let's do this. People will tell you that the concept of the Canadian mosaic that I just described is new. It's actually based on a book that was written in 1938. And this has essentially been a part of Canadian culture forever. So how does this manifest itself in the real world? And let me illustrate the concept of the mosaic with a couple of stories. Now, we had a problem in Toronto a while ago with our police force. There's a rule in Toronto that if you want to be a policeman, you have to wear a policeman's hat. And the reason for this is that if somebody is in trouble and they rush out onto the street, they want them to be able to recognize a policeman or a policewoman immediately. And of course, if you're in a crowd of people, they can't see your shoes, but they can see your hat. So rule is you have to wear a policeman's hat. The problem is we were trying to recruit people from different ethnic and cultural groups. And there were certain cultures where the men are required to wear turbans. It is a part of their culture. It's a part of their religion. And you can't put a hat on top of a turban. Well, you can, but it looks pretty stupid. Now, in the United States, they were faced with a similar problem, and they basically said, well, look, if you're not prepared to wear a hat, then just don't apply to join our police force. I'm sorry, that's the rule. It's not something that's negotiable. Well, Canadians are the kings of compromise. So what we said is we have to find a way that we achieve our needs, but at the same time, respect the needs of the other cultures. And as you can see, hopefully you can see the picture on your screen now. What they said is, we are going to create an official Toronto Police Force turban. We're also going to relax the rule about a beard. It used to be you weren't allowed to have a beard. I said, fine, we don't care about the beard. So the key to this, the fundamental point to this, to me, is a question of respect. That if you say to an immigrant to Canada, your own culture is useless and worthless, you will do everything our way or we're going to kick you out. That mindset, first of all, it's not going to help you at all. It's not going to take you anywhere. But second, that mindset is not conducive to achieving true diversity, to learning from and building from different people, different cultures. And as I said, fortunately in Canada, the one thing that we're good at is we can compromise. Now let me give you a personal story about the same concept of respect. All right, let's see if I can share that. Some years ago, I was negotiating an impact and benefits agreement in Labrador in Canada with the native people, the Innu. And we had written a contract. We were going to build a mine, but it was on their land. And we wanted them to share in the economic and the social benefits that came from the mine. Makes sense. So we had written this big complex contract, and they came to me. I was the lead finance negotiator, and they said, Jim, we want to add one clause. I said, okay, what is the one clause? They said, we want you, basically it said, we want you to promise that you will keep your commitments under the contract. And I said, well, but when I sign the contract, what it means when you sign the contract is that you agree that you will keep your commitments. And they said, no, we want you to put this clause in. I said, I don't understand why. They said, well, we just want you to do it. So I went back to Toronto to my chief legal officer. He said, Jim, we can't put this clause in. The clause is useless. It's meaningless. I said to him, Stuart, I said, if it's meaningless, that means it doesn't hurt us, right? He said, yeah, but Jim, it makes us look like idiots. I mean, you don't put this kind of a clause in a contract. I said, yeah, but it doesn't hurt us, doesn't cost us anything. He said, well, yes. I said, well, can we give it to them? He said, well, I'm going to look like an idiot, but okay, fine. Yeah, if that's what it takes. So I went back to them and I said, I don't understand why you need this clause. I honestly don't. But you're telling me you have to have it. And I can accept that and I can respect that even though I don't understand. If you tell me you have to have it, we'll put it in. And they said, thank you. I found out about a year later, I bumped into their negotiator and I said, why did you understand that clause is meaningless, right? And she said, yes, I do. And I said, why did you ask for it? And she said, Jim, we've negotiated with white people, with people of your race so many times in the past, and they basically treat us like children. They say, this is the contract, you just make your mark here if you don't know how to sign your name. We asked for the clause to see if you would give it to us, to see if you would respect us enough to give us what we wanted. She said, I don't care about the clause. The clause is meaningless, but the fact you agreed is meaningful. And that, if you like, encapsulates the Canadian concept of diversity, the concept that even if you don't fully understand what the other guy wants, you can respect something without necessarily agreeing with it and without necessarily fully understanding it. Now, one more example sort of the Canadian perspective. Let's see if I can just get this up. Now this, in Canada, we have what's called a gay pride parade. Everybody see that? And the gay pride parade, there's several parades, but the one I attend is held in Toronto. And once a year in the summer, the parade is done to honor people of alternate sexualities, gays, lesbians, trans, and so forth. Now, can you all see the guy who is in the middle of this picture wearing a pink shirt and he's holding a flag that he's waving? Well, that is Canada's Prime Minister. That's our president, Justin Trudeau. He's marching in the gay pride parade. Now, he's not gay. Well, he has a wife and 2 children. I don't think he's gay. But he marches every year in the gay pride parade. Now, I had someone tell me once, they said, yeah, Jim, but he's doing that just because he's a politician. He's doing it to get votes. You know, and there's an element of truth in that. He very much is a politician. But I said, you're missing the point. In America, in many countries, if your prime minister marched in a parade for gays and lesbians, they would lose votes. Because the population who are straight, the population who are not gay, would be upset. They would say, oh my goodness, those horrible, nasty gay people, how dare you march in their parade? The fact that in Canada, he gains votes from people like me for marching in the gay pride parade tells you something about Canadians. Now, I don't want to make it sound like everything is easy. Because marching in a parade, not a major issue. There are a number of things, there are a number of situations we face where there's a trade-off between cultural or religious or social rights and Canadian law. Like, for example, there's one thing that's been argued around the world now. When Jewish people eat meat, the meat has to be prepared in a very particular kosher way. And what it means is the animal who is being killed cannot be stunned before the animal is killed. It's similar to the halal issue in other parts of Asia. Well, some countries have banned this on the basis that it is cruel to the animals. There's about 10 countries around the world that say this kind of killing is simply not acceptable. Other countries permit it. And it highlights the question, where do you draw the line? Like, how much are you willing to modify the rules to accommodate people's legitimate cultural or religious needs? And there's an even better issue that's currently being faced in Canada relating to something called the kirpan. See, for certain people, for certain Sikhs, the men are required to carry a small life called the kirpan. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. And they carry it all the time. Now, they don't actually attack people with it, but this is one of the tenets of their faith. This is not a if you like thing, this is a must do. And we've had cases in Canada where young Sikh men have gone to school with a knife. Now, usually in Canada, you're not allowed to bring a knife into a school because they're afraid that the children are going to get upset, they're going to do something bad. What they did, as I say, Canadians were kings of compromise. What we did is we said, I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to allow the kids to bring this knife, into the school, except that the blade has to be a certain length. It can't be longer than this, and that the knife has to be sealed. Different provinces in Canada are different. And by sealed, what I mean is you take the knife, you take the scabbard, and you take some glue. And you put the glue on the knife, you put it in the scabbard, you let the glue harden to the point where you can't take the knife out anymore. It's in there, like it's a real knife, but it's glued into the scabbard. So if somebody just had got angry and said, damn, I'm going to stab you, well, no, they're not. And Canada is one of the few countries in the world that have started allowing Sikh to wear the kirpan on airplanes. Because I have a little knife, pocket knife I travel with. It's about the length of my baby finger. It's called a box cutter. And I've had those taken away from me when I try to get on a plane, because even a knife that small, you are not allowed to take on a plane in Canada. But they're willing to allow the kirpan. Well, the problem is you're fighting the question of airplane safety versus inequity. Like, I can't bring my box cutter, but somebody can bring their knife. Yeah, well, it's their religion, it's not my religion. The question of accommodation of diversity is complex, and it's sometimes difficult to know where to draw the line. So that, I think, is all I have to say about diversity. In Canada, I think we make every effort to accommodate, but there are cases. I'll give you an example. It used to be in the Mormon religion that polygamy was acceptable, that a man could have multiple wives. And they brought a court case in Canada in the 1800s saying, well, this is my religion, I should be allowed to have multiple wives. And the Canadian court says, no, I'm sorry. There are limits to how much we can accommodate. So that, to me, is where the issue lies now, is the question of how much can you accommodate, what conditions, what compromises can you make to permit the diversity while at the same time preserving the legal and the existing social structure. So that's all I've got to say on diversity. I'm now going to move on to the second part of the talk, which is ethics and morality. Now, one of the things you almost have to do when you're starting with something like that is to talk about what is the difference between ethics and morality. And to me, that's fundamental to this discussion. Now, different dictionaries, different places in the world, they treat them in different ways. In some places, they will tell you ethics and morality are exactly the same. Well, in Canada, in North America, they are similar, but there's a very important difference. And the difference is that when you speak about ethics, you're talking about systematizing concepts of right and wrong. Ethics relate to a group of people. In Canada, you talk about medical ethics. Like doctors, before they're allowed to practice, they have to take the Hippocratic oath and swear that they will do no harm and all that kind of thing. Lawyers, they take an oath to act as officers of the court. You talk about Christian ethics. You talk about accountants. I'm an accountant. We have a code of ethics that I have to sign off on that I'm going to do. Now, I don't write that code. I agree with 99% of it, but this is a code that is derived by a group of people. Now, when you talk about a particular individual, then you're talking not about ethics, but about morality. And when I say morality, some people, they use the word morality only in the context of religious morality. I don't do that. Morality, to me, the concept of right and wrong transcends religion. And the problem with morality is that morality does not necessarily coincide with ethics. But in my mind, morality is what drives ethics. Like, to give you an example, in the 1700s in Canada, it was considered ethical to own slaves. And at one point, there were 1,000 Black slaves in Canada, which is kind of funny in a way, because people criticize Canada. Oh, you had slaves. We had 1,000 slaves at peak. At peak, the United States had 4 million. Anyway, we had 1,000 slaves. And if you had said to people, is that ethical to own a slave? They would have said, absolutely. You know, it's legal. The leaders say it's fine. But a relatively small group of people said, you know, this is complete BS. This makes no sense at all. This is completely unacceptable. And they brought in legislation, 1793, the Canadian Act to eliminate slavery. But as an aside, remember I said the Canadians, we are the kings of compromise. In the United States, when they tried to eliminate slavery, they had a civil war that cost them hundreds of thousands of lives. In Canada, what happened is the people who wanted to eliminate slavery, they knew that if they just asked for a vote, should we eliminate slavery tomorrow? The vote would have been no, because there were too many wealthy people who owned slaves, and they would have voted in their own self-interest. So what they did is they brought in a compromise. And they said the existing slaves would not be freed, but anybody who comes into Canada, the minute you step across the Canadian border, if you were a slave elsewhere, if you were a slave in America or in Britain or in France or anywhere else, the minute you step across the Canadian border, you're a free person. And children and all that. So there are some people who say this is a wonderful piece of legislation. There are some people who say it didn't go far enough and, you know, Canadians are all wusses. And there's an element of truth in that, Canadians are wusses. But this is an example of a distinction between ethics and morality. That group who said, this is just immoral, this is not right. The hell with what the law says. This is not right. They were using their morals, and morals drive ethics in the long term. Eventually, more and more people said slavery is wrong, and they changed the ethics of the culture. They changed the law. They changed the understanding. What happened in Canada, even though technically people were allowed to keep their existing slaves, you became a social pariah if you had a slave. It was no longer fashionable. So these rich people who had a slave, you know, just to cook their food in the kitchen, they would get rid. They'd say, "Look, you're free. Just go away. You know, you're no longer. You don't make me look good anymore." And by the time Britain outlawed slavery in 1833, there were, I think, 100 slaves left in all of Canada. Not because people had put a gun to their head, but because it was no longer socially acceptable, was no longer fashionable. So this is an example, morality driving ethics. A second example was suffrage. Women were not allowed to vote in Canada until the early 1900s. And if you asked people then, I'm not kidding, I'm not making this up. If you had said to people, should women be allowed to vote? They would have said, no, you know, women, they can't control their emotions, you know, their brains aren't the same as men, you know, they would start to cry, you know, they can't, there's no way they should be allowed to vote. And you'd say to them, well, but there are women doctors, there are women lawyers, there are women scientists, you know, are you suggesting that they are mentally incapable of voting? You know, well, you know, but a minority of people force their views and change the ethics. Segregation in the United States is another example. There was a time when Black children and white children went to different schools because Black children, they just couldn't possibly survive in a white school. Well, eventually some intelligent people said, you know, this is complete BS. Put them together. In each case, what is happening is the ethics are being challenged by usually evolutions in personal morality, people who are taking on a new perspective, a new view that frequently is not, it's not common, it's not obvious. Now, sometimes what you're fighting is the law. Like slavery at one point, the law very clearly said you're allowed to own a slave. And so what you're trying to do is change the law. But sometimes what you're trying to do, what your morality is doing, is it is changing a mindset. It is changing not the law, but the way people think and the way people act. Like right now, the Me Too movement about sexual exploitation of women in business and in life is saying, guys, the law says you're not allowed to do this, but people are turning a blind eye. Can we please treat this as serious? Can we please respect these women? They're victims. And a lot of people, they're saying, well, gee, you know, I didn't realize it was that big a problem. Well, wake up, guys. Yes, it is. The Black Lives Matter movement. There's been considerable research that indicates that, for example, the encounter between a Black suspect and a white policeman is treated differently than it is between a white suspect and a white policeman. And that's an issue because the fact that there's a difference gives rise to issues that shouldn't be there. And it can become self-perpetuating. Let me give you another one of the stories. This is a Toronto story. Some years ago, the customs officials at Toronto's International Airport were accused of being prejudiced, being racially prejudiced against Native Canadians and against Black people. And one of the customs officials, he spoke to the newspaper anonymously, and he said, let me explain to you what happens. He said, you've got a young Black man, you've got a young Aboriginal, and he's never traveled internationally before. He's never been on a plane, but he's going to Paris. Oh, wow, this is fun. And he said, and his father says to him, son, there's something I need to explain to you. Because you are Aboriginal, because you're Innu, you will be treated differently. When you come back to Canada, they will ask you more questions. They will challenge you more than they would if you were white. And I'm sorry, son, but that's the way it is. So the young man, he goes to Paris, has a good time, comes back, he's standing in line, and he's nervous. He's thinking, oh, damn, they're going to put me through the ringer. They're going to ask me all these questions. I'm not comfortable with this. What this customs official said is, we are trained to identify nervousness and to deal with people who are nervous, to ask them some additional questions. So that young Innu man, that young Black man, he comes to me, standing in front of me, and he's visibly nervous. He's looking at the ground. He won't look me in the eye. He sort of mumbles his answers. I am trained when someone is like that to ask them additional questions. Regardless of race, regardless of age, regardless of gender. And so I asked him some more questions. And eventually I let him go. He goes home and he said, you know something, Dad, you were absolutely right. The white guy in front of me, the guy asked him 3 questions and boom, he was gone. Me, they asked me 15 questions. Clearly, it's a function of my race. The expectation becomes self-perpetuating. Because you expect to be, they say perception is 90% mental, because you expect to be taken advantage of, because you expect to be discriminated against, that's what you perceive. Now, when you're talking about morality in this context, you have to be careful. there's a distinction between morality and preference. Like society is all about rules. Like in Canada, you're only allowed to drive at a certain number of kilometers per hour. And if you want to get married, you have to have a marriage license and you have to be of a certain age and you have to do all that kind of thing. You know, if you are a young person up to a certain age, you are required to go to school. You could say, well, I don't think I need to go to school. Or you're not allowed to drive in Canada till you're 16. Well, my 15-year-old daughter, she is an exceptionally good driver, an exceptionally good, I think she should be allowed to drive at 15. Well, the rules are the same for everybody. And some people will say it's immoral to tell a 15-year-old they can't drive. Well, to me, it's one thing to disagree with an item, to say, I believe it to be 15 should be the age, or in Canada, you're allowed to drink alcohol at, I think it's 19. In the States, it's 21. You can quibble about whether it should be 19 or 20, but to me, that is not a moral decision. That is just society has to pick a number to be fair to everybody, and you don't like the number they picked. I don't see that as morality. There are other things that are sort of kind of moral. Let me just come back here. There are other things that are sort of moral, but the question of morality is a little bit blurry, like gambling, for example. You know, things like lotteries. You know, the Dutch had a lottery in the 1700s. The Spanish El Gordo lottery was in the 1800s. Well, they've been around forever. Canada only brought in lotteries in 1978 because we were deathly afraid that people would spend their rent money on lottery tickets. And it was our ethics that gambling was dangerous, and gambling, people were not going to be able to handle it, and all that kind of thing. To me, that's not really an ethical, you know, I don't see gambling as evil. Gambling, like alcohol, is something that some people can't handle. Some people, you know, they need help in dealing with, but it isn't fundamentally problematic. A better example for me, an example of where Canada really has trouble drawing the line, is in well, let me just digress for a moment. I digress very well. To give you a better example of the difference between morals and ethics, a very Canadian example. In the 1960s, abortions in Canada were only legal if they were done in a hospital. And because the hospitals had a very strong religious component, hospitals would almost never permit abortions. And there's a Dr. Morgentaler, he was Polish born, emigrated to Canada. He opened an abortion clinic in Montreal, and everybody was aghast. It's, oh my God, it's an abortion clinic. He's a murderer. It's terrible. And they kept trying it. They kept charging him and taking him to court and trying to send him to jail. And every time the jury said, no, he's innocent, I refuse to send him to jail. And it's funny because there's a concept in Canadian law called jury nullification, where if a jury believes that the answer that the law is giving is just unfair, the jury can just say the hell with it. I'm not sending him to jail. I don't care what the law says. I'm not sending him to jail. Well, Morgentaler in 2008 was awarded the Order of Canada, which is the highest award that Canada can give, for the work that he did forcing a change in Canadian ethics. Now, here's an example of a man whose personal morality was that abortion should be illegal, that it was placing women at risk, and he put himself on the line. He was brought to court many, many times. He even spent some time in jail before they eventually had to let him out. His morals changed Canada. His morals changed the world, or changed my world. Now, the one other example I wanted to show you about how confused Canada can get when it's faced with a moral issue is the question of prostitution. Now, prostitution in and of itself is legal in Canada. Selling sexual services is legal in Canada. However, buying sexual services is a criminal offense. Advertising, criminal offense. Living on the benefits of prostitution, criminal offense. Soliciting in public, criminal offense. Now, some of the people who are arguing that prostitution should be made more legal, they say, okay, let me see if I get this straight. You know, a woman is allowed to sell sexual services, but she can't sell it to another human being because they'd be breaking the law. She can't tell anyone that she's selling it. And if she makes money for selling sexual services, she has to flush that money down the toilet, because if she uses that money to buy groceries, she's living on the proceeds of, work with me here. Now, what's happened here, this is an example of the morality ethics fight taking place, where the people who believe that prostitution is fundamentally evil and fundamentally wrong and it should not be there are just, they cannot get their heads around, they cannot get together with the people who say that providing more flexibility in, for example, the Dutch model will result in these women or these men, these young boys in some case, being protected, where right now they lack that protection. Canada can't get their heads around it. Let's see. Okay, we're almost at the end. So I'm going to end with two thoughts. The question of, people will say, if your country has a law and you're Morgentaler and you say, I believe the law is unfair, I'm going to do what I believe to be right, and the hell with the law. Does this make you a traitor? Well, a very famous American writer once said that patriotism is when you support your country all the time, but your government only when it deserves it. My personal view is that a person like Morgentaler, people like the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter people, they are the biggest patriots, because they are putting their own reputation, their own liberty on the line. Some of them are going to jail for what they believe in, and they're doing it to make their country a better place. Last thought. People will say to you, yeah, well, you can't change the world. One Morgentaler cannot change a whole country's view on abortion. Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, she put this very well, that people will tell you that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens cannot change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has changed the world. And on that note, I thank you, and I'll ask Lale to open the floor for questions.